Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are back with University of Alberta professor Andrew Leach. On the rare occasion that I do two interviews in a row because events happened. I wanted to have a chat about what happened with the pause on carbon pricing for heating oil, because I know you were one of the people who was particularly critical about this particular move. And as someone who helped design the whole carbon pricing mechanism in Alberta initially, which the federal government cribbed heavily, I figured we would have a quick chat about what what the federal government should have been doing differently.
Sure. Well, it's nice to be back and they get the 2 weeks in a row. I don't think my visit to Ottawa had almost 2 weeks in a row, I guess. I don't think my visit to Ottawa had much to do with it, but things have changed a lot since I was there. So maybe on my book, we're now closer to doom and we're denying the doom. I don't know what it is, but it's, I think what was disappointing was not even so much what they did, it's the way they talked about it, right? To say, we've known since the carbon pricing program was put in, well, since it was put in Alberta, but even before that, that fundamentally people with more money and larger homes and larger cars use more emissions. And the lump sum rebate means that, almost all of the people in the lowest income brackets, not necessarily the people who are struggling most with the affordability per se right now, but, the people who are in the lower end of the income brackets are better off. And so what the government's done is essentially said, to solve an affordability crisis, we're going to give a small check to people at the low end, or something of small value to people at the lower end of the income distribution, something of larger value to people who are higher up the income distribution. And then a year from now, we're going to cut the rebates for everybody. Apart from the rural residents who get a higher rebate. But if the system's going to keep balancing out, then the rebates for everybody have to give. So that narrative is just, it's wrong, right? If you say, I want and I think this is Stephen Gordon, and I think Trevor Tombe had a similar thing to say, if you're worried about the affordability crisis, fundamentally that's an income problem. It's not a price of heating oil problem. And the government has all kinds of means to solve income problems. And this is a, small and really poorly aimed solution to an income problem. And then it's going to make the income problem worse for some people by reducing the value of that rebate, even if they don't, especially for people who don't use home heating oil, people who heat with natural gas, for example, they're going to get the same price effects with a worse income situation. And so it doesn't really solve the problem you say you're solving. And then, of course, the knock-on effect was in the way they presented it for everybody on this planet, well, not on this planet, on this country, to say, well, what about me? And, the third piece I would say is the way that it really undercut a government that has been one of the key allies of carbon pricing in this country, BC, right? That all of a sudden you have this announcement that says we're cutting home heating oil or carbon tax on home heating oil. Well, there are people who use home heating oil in BC. And so, the premier of BC gets blindsided by these questions of, well, what about us? And what are you going to do with your system? And so I think there was just planning, comms, and it's a bad solution to a problem.
So, because you're not the person to argue with comms on this, and I'm going to agree with you that this was a horrifically rolled out comms plan, that they didn't even get their narrative straight in question period for another full week. But that
is it consistent now? Or do we have it now? Do we have the story now?
They did a better job in terms of pointing out the price differential between home heating oil and natural gas, and the situation of energy poverty in that particular part of the country, which they should have done better and sooner. But it also still, I mean, and also the fact that, I mean, it took them also a week to point out just how many more people outside of Atlantic Canada use heating oil than people inside Atlantic Canada. And then Goody Hutchings' musings on CTV did not help one bit,
No, they
because
did
that
not.
just drove a spike in the coffin there. But anyway, that aside, what would have been the better alternative to deal with this issue in terms of the energy poverty issue in those particular parts of the country, because they are dependent on this source of heat, which is, as they were pointing out, between 2 and 4 times more expensive than natural gas.
Yeah, so I think they got 2 of the 3 things right. Right? They got the rebate part right, which is the solving the income problem, and they got the heat pump program right to an extent, which is solving the longer term, I guess, 2-part problem. One is the expensive heating oil, and then the second one is just expensive heat in general. So if you can get people to a more efficient heating system using a cheaper fuel, then great. And so the cheaper source of energy per unit heat. So you get 2 wins there of with 2 of the 3. It was the carbon pricing cut that, again, you're creating this wedge between, in some cases, remember, the people who are on natural gas, they're the people who, a lot of them switched to reduce emissions, and they were doing what the government told them to do. They took advantage of government programs, et cetera. And now you're coming in and saying, okay, great, glad you did that. Now your emissions are priced. The emissions of the people who haven't done that yet, appreciating all of what, there is a very real problem and of energy poverty, but the carbon price isn't the driver of that. It's the oil use. And so, well, it's 2 things. It's the use of heating oil, and it's the broader income levels. So rebates or more broad-based income support programs solve that problem. And, heating oil is far from the only affordability problem that people are having right now. Mm-hmm. And then the heat pump conversion and the way that that's been modified now to see nearly free and limited upfront for people in lower and middle income houses, right? That's the other piece of this, is that a lot of the federal programs, even though notionally it's like, well, you get a really good deal on a heat pump, it's that you need to be able to front the energy inspection, you need to be able to front the cost of your heat pump, you need to be able to navigate all of the bureaucratic systems to get your rebate. And then at the end of the day, okay, you get your rebate. Oh, you got to pay for a final inspection, then you get your rebate. And so that's fine for me. I can manage that. But there are a lot of people for whom that's not going to be a reasonable thing when you're already, if the problem you're trying to solve is people are crunched for making ends meet, great, we'll help you out. Just, give us $1,000 up front. And that's not ideal. So it's nice to see them thinking about that. But the piece that they're still missing, right, is this is still all stuff driven at homeowners. And so, or at least the heat pump program. So how do you get into multi-unit buildings? I mean, there's not that many of them now that probably are on oil, but there's going to be some. And how do you get that through the landlord-tenant type relationships and make sure that, you have a program that works beyond just the here's my bonus for a homeowner program. But to me, it's all about income and technology. It's not, the price of heating oil with or without a carbon tax is still phenomenally more expensive. It still makes lots of sense to get people off that fuel source.
I did want to also ask, just you had tweeted something the other day that was very eye-catching in terms of the saying you're not going to be able to get everyone off of heating oil in 3 years. And I just wanted you to unpack that a little more for me.
Well, I can't remember who I was responding to. It's always bad when I hear you tweeted something the other day, and I'm thinking, what could, like, I tweeted a lot of things that we could be about to talk about, and I don't know what they are. But in that case, I think it was related to the a statement I think Sean Fraser made in the House, if I remember correctly, saying, we're going to act and get everyone off heating oil. And it's just, this is going to take time for a variety of reasons. And, you have people who are not going to be able to deal with the renos. You have some of the upfront still dealing with the costs, et cetera. When we're in a situation of energy poverty, which is ostensibly the problem we're trying to solve, you're not really probably in that capacity to do that. And it's still a lot of houses, right? When you think of how many we're talking about, I think, close to 1 million households when you add them up over the country. So that's a lot of furnace to heat pump type replacements in a relatively short period of time. So can you get a lot of them? Probably, but you're not going to get everybody. And so now you're, if I'm in the Liberals' office, you're setting yourself up for, now I'm the party that's going to tax you at, whatever the number is going to be, $110 a ton, versus the party that's not. And if you're, and again, it comes back to, like, if your answer was, we're doing this out of affordability, well, that problem is probably still going to be there in 3 years from now for some people. And the problem they got themselves into with this was, we're giving benefits to some people that we're not giving to others. And so now you're flipping it, and it's going to be, well, now we have to decide to impose costs on some people and not on others. And it's still going to be a complicated world.
For sure. And also, just anecdotally, I've heard some people who have been trying to make the switch to heat pumps haven't been able to get them just because of supply issues. So I think that's probably also going to be a factor in there as well.
Yeah, and you have, it's not new technology in the sense that I think my parents had one that was like the size of a Datsun at our house in Ottawa in the 80s. Like, it was a giant thing. But what is relatively new are the cold climate heat pumps, the ones that perform reasonably well when it's in the -20s. And but you have, limited installer capability to do this. And that's part and parcel too of saying, we don't have just install companies waiting on the premise that we might all of a sudden need to replace 800,000 more heating systems than we had planned to previously, right? So there's going to be capacity issues. There's going to be, situations where, it's sort of a free notional heat pump, but can you actually get the people? Can you get the equipment you want? What else needs to be done in your house to get this system installed? Are there electrical questions? Are there HVAC changes? Yeah. And so for those individuals, there are going to be complexities. And so I think it's just one of those things where you say, this isn't the government can snap its fingers and make these things go away.
Right. And while I've got you, I had one more thing I wanted to ask you from your other economics hat, which is the thing that conservative MPs have been saying repeatedly for the last couple of weeks is the notion that the carbon price is 16% of inflation. And I know that's wrong, and that's wrong, but can you help me just explain this? To how the math is not working there.
Sure. Well, part of it is just the definitions don't align. So if you say, how much does the carbon price mechanically? So just if I assume that all that happens is the carbon price increases and there's no other impact at all in the economy of that, across the economy of that change, then, StatsCan has fuel in their inflation calculation, their consumer price index basket. And so that increase in the price of fuel in and of itself creates that relatively small increase in price levels and in the CPI basket. So that has a relatively small impact on inflation each year. And of course, as the carbon price goes up, that's going to happen year after year after year. A level impact on inflation, or actually a slightly decreasing impact on inflation, because the percentage change in the carbon price is getting smaller over time. But the question, and so that was the question that was asked the Bank of Canada.
Right.
And I think the Bank of Canada there answered it mechanically. They could have answered it and gone a little more in depth and said, well, the total impact once you take into account indirects. But they gave a quick answer of just sort of to give you a sense of the order of magnitude. This is how it's small in the grand scheme.
0.15% is his particular response.
Yeah, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of inflation. And then the clarification that they gave was, or they were asked another question, like if you remove the carbon tax entirely, so if you wiped out,
go from 65
all
to
of
zero,
the accumulated, goes 65 to zero, what would that do to inflation? And so that would be a one-time drop mechanically in price levels. And so that for a year would have a downward impact on inflation of 0.6, I think was the number
that was the number he gave,
which makes sense. It's currently we have a carbon price of $65 a ton. So if you sort of do the math and you say we've gone up roughly 4 times that over time, it's like, 4 times that $15 annual increment over time. So 0.6 is the impact of that one-time decrease, but it's not going to be replicated over time. And the reason why I say it's about definitions is, inflation is about how much are prices this year relative to last year. It's not a cumulative measure of all of the total. It's not the CPI, it's the change in the CPI. So, and what the Bank of Canada is concerned about when it's doing interest rates for inflation protection purposes is not, was there a one-time change in the price level? Is there systematic overheating of the economy, so to speak, that's going to lead to continued compounded price levels? So the error is not just in the math, it's in the implication that somehow if you didn't have the carbon price, that the Bank of Canada wouldn't have had to respond with higher interest rates and wouldn't have had all of this. And that's frankly nonsense, right? We've seen the inflationary environment is all over the place. And central banks are having to respond in the same way as we responded with fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus in the downturn. We're responding with some monetary kind of controls to prevent that hugely inflationary response in the rebound. So is that driven by the carbon price? No. But the other, once you really dig into the weeds is, let's think for a second about what people are arguing. If they're saying the carbon tax is fundamentally inflationary, it's that it's driving an overheated economy. It's causing an expansionary cycle in our economy, which is exactly what the Conservatives have been arguing against since Dion, right? That if this is a job-killing, economy-killing carbon tax that's scaring away investment and crushing our productivity and all of the other things that people want to argue, it's deflationary.
You would think.
And taxes in general, right? The carbon tax itself, if you run it through what economists would call the general equilibrium model to say what happens as people respond to a tax, the tax part of it is deflationary. It's preventing some spending that would otherwise occur, it's shifting it, et cetera. What's inflationary is the rebates.
Right.
So that's the stimulus. Like if we were going to stimulate the economy, fiscally, not monetarily. If we're going to fiscally stimulate the economy, build some gazebos in Muskoka, for example, you pile stimulus dollars into the economy, give people money to spend. And that's kind of what the rebates do. They're quarterly checks from the government. If they weren't there, left to its own device, like just that in a vacuum. So if we said we collect the carbon tax, we light the money on fire, we don't refund it to anybody, then that is in general, a deflationary policy. If you had the rebates on their own, right? This is also what Conservatives have been arguing. The government checks flowing out into the economy were the cause of inflation. Now, that's not really the case, but that's been their argument all along. So if you're going to take their previous arguments at face value, right? A job-killing carbon tax, quote unquote, doesn't sound very inflationary. A government check rebate does. So it's the rebate that's actually, if anything, going to have some inflationary consequences. The carbon price is going to be more deflationary. So, Governor Macklem might have added a little bit of that, not just the mechanical, how much, and I think what he was answering there was, we see the price of gas in the inflation numbers, right? That's in the
Mhm.
index. How important is the carbon price in that price of gas? And then how important is the price of gas in the inflation basket? But I think stepping back, if you're looking at the entire macroeconomic system, that carbon tax isn't going to be strongly inflationary, even to there's no real way you could support the idea that it would be left on its own.
Mhm. All right.
That was a long, rambly answer, but
but it did help put some of the pieces together. And thank you so much for that. Thanks again
yeah,
for doing this.
we're all
Don't
converting to
forget
heating.
his book, Between
I thought you
Doom
were going to ask me
and
about converting to heating oil and Nate Horner. That would have been fun too.
Smile. All
Sorry,
right.
I interrupted you.
No worries. Once again, yes, your book, Between Doom and Denial, it's available. And thanks again for doing this. And we'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much.
All right. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.